even if we're able to push the evildoers and the totalitarians back for another generation, maybe if we work really hard, maybe even 2 generations, if they've got the young people, it's over. And right now, I don't mean to sound like a doom monger, but I think we just need an honest assessment of where we're at. Right now, Christians in America are losing this battle in a catastrophic way.
Living proof of the phrase, it's not what you know, but who you know, and broadcasting from my co-ed man cave in northeastern Oklahoma, I'm your host, Garritt Hampton, and you are listening to The Thinking Dad. I am so glad you've joined me today as we kick off the Thinking Dad podcast. I have my good friend, Alex Newman, with me today, and I know this conversation is going to blow you away. I don't ever tell Alex this, but he is one of the smartest people I know, and it's a huge privilege getting to launch the Thinking Dad podcast with him as my first guest. I'm going to let Alex tell you a little bit more about himself and his family, but first, I need to tell you about my sponsor today, CTC Math. As you know, this is a brand new show, and CTC Math came in from the very beginning with a lot of support because they believe in the mission here. I want you to check them out. Here's the thing. Thinking dads raise thinking kids. And one of the most important things you can do as a father is to make sure your kids are getting a great education to prepare them for life. Whether or not you homeschool, I know most of you men aren't doing the bulk of the teaching in your homes, but I hope you're still deeply invested in your children's education. So I have an assignment for you. Ask your wife how your kids are doing in math. First, it'll give you a great opportunity to win major husband points. And second, if they're struggling, you can be the hero and suggest a fantastic solution. It's the one that my family uses and loves, CTC Math. And if your kids are in school, good news, they can benefit from CTC Math too. CTC Math will fill in the gaps and make sure your kids, even the struggling math learners, have a solid foundation. Try it for free today at ctcmath.com. They have a money-back guarantee that I promise you're not going to need because it's a great product. Check them out, ctcmath.com. Tell them thank you for supporting the Thinking Dad podcast right from the beginning. All right, let's get into our conversation with Alex. Well, Alex, for our listeners who may not know you, take a minute to tell us about yourself and your family.
Well, thank you so much, brother. It's really a great honor to be on your program. I appreciate you and your wife and all the work you guys do for the Lord and for his church. It's just, it's a tremendous honor to be here with you. So thank you, Garrett. As for me, I'm, most importantly, I'm a child of the Most High, adopted into his family. I like to evangelize. That's kind of my thing. My day job is journalism, and so I'm a Christian journalist. My motto comes out of Ephesians chapter 5, verse 11. The Apostle Paul says, "Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them," or expose them, some translations say. And so I just feel unbelievably blessed that I get to reprove and expose the unfruitful works of darkness all day, every day, 6 days a week. I have my own company, Liberty Sentinel Media. We do a lot of different things. We produce some shows. We put out a newsletter. We operate a website. We've got contracts with a lot of great ministries and organizations to help them. I also serve as senior editor of the New American Magazine. I'm a regular contributor to a lot of different publications, including the Epic Times, now one of the largest newspapers in the country. And so it's just a real blessing to be able to speak truth into the culture, into society. And obviously, as you know, Garrett, one of my major passions is education and discipleship. I think it's the most important crisis facing our families, our churches, and of course, our country. And so, again, tremendous honor to be here with you to talk about what I consider to be one of the most important issues. Oh, and I forgot to mention on the education front, I have a volunteer job, too. I'm the executive director of a ministry called Public School Exit. Our goal is to get as many children out of the government schools as quickly as possible and to knock down every possible barrier. We don't want money. We don't want time. We don't want anything to be an obstacle to especially Christian children, but really all children, to be liberated from the government indoctrination camps posing as schools.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. We stand with you. And many of our listeners may know you've been a guest on the Schoolhouse Rocked podcast a few times with my wife, Yvette. And I'll tell you, Alex, looking back at the movie Schoolhouse Rocked that we produced, Everything about that movie, I just love. I love how God put the cast together and everything they brought to the film. And the one thing I just wish I could go back and do again is I wish I could have had your voice in the film. We met you after it was filmed, and man, I wish you could have been in it, because I've heard you speak many, many times on this subject, and every time it's just exactly what's needed at the right time. So thank you. You recently posted on Twitter, or X now, which, man, I still can't deal with the name change. I'll be honest.
I still call it Twitter too.
I know. You tweeted, "The issue that transcends and supersedes all others is education. If we lose on that front, we lose all other battles." Why is it that serious, Alex?
Well, the simple answer is that whoever captures the hearts, the minds, and ultimately the souls of the children is going to direct the future. And this is not some unique discovery that I have made. The totalitarians have understood this for at least a century, probably longer. It just wasn't feasible to corral all the children into brainwash camps. But today, that is not only feasible, it's the norm, it's the accepted standard. And the reality is, even if we're able to push the evildoers and the totalitarians back for another generation, maybe if we work really hard, maybe even 2 generations, if they've got the young people, it's over. And right now, I don't mean to sound like a doom monger, but I think we just need an honest assessment of where we're at. Right now, Christians in America are losing this battle in a catastrophic way. 80 to 90% of Christian children from Christian homes who go through 12 years of government education are going to leave the church and leave the faith. You look at the polling data. Scientific poll commissioned by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, they found that 70% of my generation, I'm one of those goofy millennials, 70% of us say we're going to vote for socialists in the future. Socialism, I think, is best understood as the antithesis of everything that the Bible teaches, everything that God has ordained. And then another scientific poll, again, looking at millennials, for the first time in all American history, we have a generation where a majority rejects Christianity. Less than half of millennials identify as Christians. They didn't drill down any further on that. I would have liked to talk to those 48 or 49% or whatever it was who identify as Christians, because I have talked to a lot of them, and what you'll find very quickly is they're Christian in name only. They have no relationship with the Lord. They have no understanding of what he teaches, what he expects from us. It's just because their parents took them to church or something. So this is a catastrophe. We are going to lose on all these other fronts. Now, I always caution, first of all, Christian education doesn't save your children. Jesus Christ does. And second of all, we know for a fact that the gates of hell will never prevail against the church. But that doesn't mean that Christianity will continue in America. That doesn't mean that America will continue to be a tool that God used to spread the gospel throughout the whole world. In fact, at the current rate that we're going, I suspect America will be a genuinely post-Christian country within a generation or two if we don't stop the bleeding.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're there. One of the things I often say is, it doesn't matter how committed the Christians are currently in the church. If all the adults are there serving God faithfully and reading their word and living out the Great Commission, aside from this area, if their children are being educated by the secular state, the church dies in a generation. There's just no way around that. So you say we lose all these battles, and you've talked a little bit about these different realms. I want to just throw a few at you really quickly, and I want to hear how you would say this overwhelming influence of public schools is affecting these realms. Okay, first of all, the family, the basic unit of structure in our culture. How is it affected?
The family is being demolished. In fact, we're watching a controlled demolition of the family unit. We all know the statistics. I mean, half of marriages, they say, in the United States end in divorce. The overwhelming majority of children in a lot of different communities are raised in single-parent households. Young people are overwhelmingly rejecting even the idea of marriage, the idea of family. It's at the point now where a huge segment of our young people, depending on what part of the country you're in, are now hoping to be castrated, hoping to have hysterectomies and double mastectomies, making them literally incapable of ever starting a real family. So this is, it's hard to overstate the significance of this, right? Family is the most important building block of civilization. Marriage, of course, is a representation of the relationship between Christ and the church. It's a supernatural institution. And what happens as the family crumbles is everything else crumbles along with it. And I submit to you, Garrett, this is a direct result. And I'm not beating around the bush and no sugarcoating this. This is a direct result of the indoctrination taking place in government schools. In fact, I've got 2 chapters in my new book dealing with this very process. Both of them surround the influence of so-called sex education, the transgenderism and things. And so we've watched this very, very steady progression. Now, there are other factors as well. Of course, the government's war on poverty, literally subsidizing unwed motherhood. So there's a lot of policies that contributed to this, but I would argue that overwhelmingly the most dominant force responsible for this is the indoctrination of children in not just godless government schools, but literally pagan, literally diabolical schools that are where the curriculum is calculated to undermine, first of all, children's relations with their parents, and second of all, children's desire to have a family, to have children, and to pass on values, culture, tradition to the next generation. I would say this is probably one of the most catastrophic problems with what's happening in the government school is the war that it's waging on the family.
I completely agree. I saw the other day a statistic, and I've seen this before. It depends on who's polling, what results you get, but it looks like approximately 20% of Gen Z identifies as some form of LGBTQI, whatever. And among girls, the number is higher. And I've seen as high as 30% of that generation. And the problem is you look at the graph and it goes generation to generation, it goes low, 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 and then it just launches up. And it's impossible to think that that's not an effect of this indoctrination that's been poured into the schools. We have Planned Parenthood and other organizations, GLSEN and these organizations who are in the schools, and they're effectively discipling kids in the religion of sexual freedom and immorality and the complete divorce from a moral foundation. So I agree with you. We talked a little bit about the death of the church. So I want to go to the next realm, which is the state. How is the public school affecting the state of our nation, of our states, and our republic?
Well, the simple term is it is throwing it into chaos with the ultimate goal of destroying it. One more quick thing to say about the collapse of the family. This was always the design from the very beginning when these sex ed things started coming in. In fact, the first guy to really seriously propose the idea of government schools, Robert Owen, back in the early 1800s, his goal was to eliminate Christianity, according to a whistleblower. And part of the process of doing that was breaking down the family. The communists in Eastern Europe understood this 100 years ago. They brought these ideas over to the United States through the Frankfurt School. They painted the father as an authoritarian, as a fascist. So this was always the calculated design because they understood that it would break down the family, which would break down the culture, and of course, Christianity, which was their big target. Once you interrupt that transfer of values and things from one generation to the next, they thought they'd have a blank slate to write on. And this same process is now taking place when it comes to the nation, when it comes to the government. So America was founded largely on biblical principles of government, of society, of culture, etc. Now, that doesn't mean every single one of the founders was a Bible-believing Christian. That's probably not the case. But the principles that were articulated, these come directly from the Bible. Yeah, Thomas Jefferson called them a self-evident truth, but he actually stole that language, not the self-evident truth part, but the part about a God-given right to life, liberty, property, etc. He stole that language from the Presbyterians in North Carolina, later from Samuel Adams, who circulated the document on the rights of the colonists through the Committees for Correspondence. So these were biblical principles that were at the foundation of our nation. And of course, that resulted in the Declaration of Independence, that resulted in the Constitution. Well, what we have had now is 4, maybe 5 generations of indoctrination designed to discredit not just those documents, but also the principles that underpin them. You talk to an average young person today, they have no idea what's even written in those documents. All they know is, and they regurgitate it like trained seals, slave owners, white guys, dead white guys, right? Dead old white guys is the meme du jour. And this is all very, very strategic, right? They understood that if they could discredit these principles, and these are universal principles, by the way, they come out of the Bible. They're not unique to America. Yes, America's founding fathers were sinful. They're human beings in a fallen, sinful world. But the principles are applicable anywhere and everywhere. The principle that comes out of the Bible that all men are created equal, right? Which is, of course, the principle that ended up eradicating slavery, not just here in the United States, but all over the world. That comes from the Bible. The principle that God gave us rights, like the right to life. Again, that comes straight out of the Bible. God said, thou shalt not murder. He said, murder is evil. He said, government exists to punish evil. Therefore, government has an obligation to help you protect your right to life and to punish those who infringe on it. Same thing with property. Thou shalt not steal. So these are just biblical principles. And what the schools are doing is very, very strategically and masterfully. I got to give them credit where credit is due. They're very, very good at what they're doing. They are undermining those principles. They're undermining the values, and they're actually totally reorienting children's trust and worldview in a direction that is utterly hostile to the United States of America, to the principles that the United States of America was founded on. And that's why we see young people today, literally revolutionaries, ready to go out and burn their cities down, ready to go out and open up our borders, ready to go out and surrender American sovereignty. It's because they've been brainwashed. They've been indoctrinated to believe these things. And of course, even if that wasn't happening, the destruction of the family that we talked about would lead inevitably to the destruction of the nation. But Amen. You add to that the deliberate agenda to destroy the nation, and you see we are facing a catastrophe if we don't get this turned around.
Amen. Okay. I'm going to go one realm higher. You are a man who works on a global stage, exposing the wiles of the global elites many times. I think the last time we were texting or emailing, you had just returned from Dubai. How does this have a global impact, and what is the global strategy for these people?
So for a long time, the global strategy was not really talked about. It wasn't really on the front pages. What we're seeing now is they're coming out of the closet on this front. And of course, the global angle directly affects the effort to destroy and undermine not just the United States of America, but the nation state more broadly, and also the family around the world. In fact, you see this very clearly. To take one obvious example, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, put out global, I think they called it International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education. They want to teach 5-year-olds things that are, as the Bible says, shameful to speak of. I can't even talk about these things because they're so wicked. I wouldn't teach them to an adult, much less to a 5-year-old child. They're normalizing every kind of perversion. They're actually openly promoting relations between children and adults. It is absolutely monstrous. And so what's happening at the international level is they're trying to standardize government education around the world. And at this point, they're doing it very openly. So the UN developed some decades ago, actually, what they call the World Core Curriculum. Now, we won't get into great detail. I've got a whole chapter on this, but at its core, the guy who wrote them, his name was Robert Mueller. He's called the father of global education. He was the Assistant Secretary General of the UN. He was absolutely blasphemous. He repeatedly referred to the United Nations as the body of Christ. Of course, we as believers know that the church is the body of Christ, not this collection of gangsters and mass murderers and dictators and kleptocrats. And so he comes out and he writes in the foreword to the teacher's manual for the World Core Curriculum, which he says should be taught in every school to every child on the planet. He says that it's based on the teachings of Alice Bailey and the Tibetan teacher Juval Kul, which really that's going to mean nothing to most Americans, but it means something very significant to the global elites. I actually had a book here within grabbing distance yesterday. I wonder what I did with it. But Alice Bailey was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. That's no joke. That's what she called her organization. She claimed to be communicating with these spiritual entities that she called ascended masters. And so when the guy who writes the World Core Curriculum tells you that his teachings are based on this really communication with demons. If you read your Bible, Alice Bailey wasn't talking to any ascended masters. These are just demons from the pit of hell. I don't believe that she was a schizophrenic. I do believe she was actually communicating with supernatural, intelligent beings. And they write extensively about their vision of education. In fact, they say education is the vehicle that's going to move us into this apparently wonderful new age of conscious evolution and this fifth dimension. Of course, it's all satanic. And then to make it real, to bring it back to the United States of America. So Bill Gates, obviously very, very important public health expert and climate expert, right? At least that's what we're expected to believe. So he actually comes along, and in 2004, he goes to UNESCO headquarters in Paris and signs an agreement with UNESCO. And that agreement states that Microsoft and Bill Gates are going to work with the UN Education Agency on creating global education standards, global curricula, global teacher training programs, and even the global technology systems to make it all possible, which, by the way, the technology is a critical part of all this. And then he comes back to the United States and he starts pouring millions of dollars and then billions of dollars. He ended up putting $2.3 billion of his money behind this project known as Common Core, which today, ladies and gentlemen, is taught in every one of the 50 states. I don't care if your legislators told you they got rid of it. No, they didn't. They renamed it. In almost every case, it's like 95% Common Core with a couple things added and subtracted, and they just renamed it, the Indiana state standard. It's the same thing. And then he bought ads. Bill Gates literally bought ads to tell you what a great program this was. I've got some of them. And one of the things they brag about is that this is going to align American education with international standards. So it's them telling you what they're doing. They've been working on this for a very long time. If you go back to the founding of UNESCO, the first guy who ran it, Julian Huxley, was pretty open about how they were going to use the schools to instill kind of global citizenship in the minds of children. He was also, by the way, the head of the Eugenics Society, these pseudo-scientific racists who thought some races were better than other races and things that totally bonkers. And then he was also the head of the Humanist Association, which, of course, John Dewey and his buddies, the founder of the American public school system, thought they had invented a new religion, that you're God and I'm God. So it comes full circle, right? And as Jesus explained, you're either with me or you're against me. Well, apply that to what the UN is doing in the education realm. You'll very quickly realize they are not with Christ, even though they're very open about the fact that they want to inject spirituality education into everything. I mean, this is literally enshrined in their international agreements, Garrett. If you go to Agenda 21, Chapter 36, this is the UN's agenda for the 21st century. In Chapter 36, they tell you that this so-called education will be critical and indispensable to giving children the right attitudes, values, beliefs, etc. And they tell you that it's got to include spirituality education. And they're serious about that. It's just not any spirituality that a Christian would recognize.
Right. Yeah, it strikes me. I think it's time that Christians stop living in the American Christian bubble, especially American Christians, of course, but this Western Christian bubble. And we start understanding that in the Bible, we're told there is a plan for a global government, and it won't be run by Christ until he returns. But there is a government that will be established of the Antichrist, and all nations will be subjected to it, and it won't be a good thing. And when we see these globalists making these moves, and they're very clear now, like you said, the mask is off, it's all out in the open. We need to understand this isn't just about school. Bill Gates isn't just interested in educating our children. He's interested in being a part of a movement that will eventually establish the kingdom of the Antichrist. And so this is something, as we think globally as Christians, we have to be on guard against. We're going to talk more about this, but I think it's a good time to take a real quick break. This is a new show, guys. Thank you for joining us for the Thinking Dad podcast. I want to ask for your help. We need your help to get the word out. We want to see the Thinking Dad show reach millions of men, and we can't do it unless you spread the word. Please take a minute to share this episode. If you're enjoying what Alex is bringing, hit the share button, email it to a friend, do whatever you have to do. Tell friends at work. We need to get this word out and encourage men. Also, I want to ask you, if you're watching on YouTube or one of the video platforms, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and you hit the like, and then comment on the video. It really does help. And then if you're listening on a podcast, rate and review the podcast. But definitely, guys, share, get the word out. Also, take a minute to visit CTC Math and thank them for supporting the Thinking Dad podcast. They really have blessed us this season. They came in as our premier sponsor for the full season and really got behind us because they support the work we're doing. They're great people. So thank them, and we appreciate you joining us today. All right, let's get back to our conversation with Alex. Alex, I have in my hands your brand new book, which I actually got to see before it was released, and I wrote an endorsement for it. And I'm going to do maybe the tackiest host thing ever. I'm going to read a portion of my endorsement because I think it's so important in this conversation. When I wrote that, I said, it's long been acceptable in the public discourse to say that public schools are failing. This statement is usually accompanied by a cry for more money, smaller class sizes, revised standards, improved teacher training, increased choice, or some other half measure to fix public education. Alex, are the schools failing or broken?
I wish they were, because, we can fix things that are broken. When my car breaks, I either open up the hood and fix it myself, or I take it down to the mechanic and have him fix it, or, buy the parts and do it myself, or have one of my kids do it. But unfortunately, we're dealing with something here with these government schools that is actually working exactly as intended by the people who designed it and who foisted it upon our country. And I think we start from the biblical premise, right? Who should be in charge of education? And the answer is not government. This is a new phenomenon. For almost 2,000 years of church history, almost everybody understood that education, discipleship, was not part of the duties of the civil government, of Caesar, of the governmental sphere. So we're starting off already on an erroneous foundation. We have put the responsibility over education on an institution that was never designed or intended to have that responsibility. But the reality is, and what we show in the first 4 chapters of this book, is that the people who dreamed up this system, the people who implemented this system, the people who reformed this system to turn it from what it was into what it is today, always had a plan. And that plan always was, from the very beginning, to undermine the Christian faith, to undermine the family, to undermine biblical principles like private property, like the free enterprise system, like the nuclear family, like the purpose of government. So that was always the intention. And this can be proven. This is not something that we have to speculate about. We've got the primary source documents, the writings of the architects of this system. And so I get frustrated when I hear people say the system is broken. It's not broken. It's designed to do what it's doing. And that's the hardest thing to get people to understand, Garrett. I'll stand on a stage and tell 100 people, hey, the system is working as intended. It cannot be reformed. And then when we get to the Q&A, people say, well, okay, so how do we reform this? Like, people just cannot get it through their heads that this was the plan. And so I'm glad you led with that. I think it's so critical, especially for us who maybe operate outside the system. We have to stop playing along with this idea that it just needs some tweaks or some reforms. It's like a cancer. It needs to be completely eliminated. And I'm not anti-education any more than I would be anti-farmer by speaking out against the collective farms of the Soviet Union. I'm pro-education, but what's happening in the public schools is not education. It was never intended to be education. I think a better term for it might be anti-education. It's designed to turn your children away from God. It's designed to really handicap your children in their pursuit of truth and beauty, and it's designed to give them values that are completely contrary to everything that God teaches. There's no way that can be considered education in any legitimate sense of the term.
It strikes me that the more we pour into the schools to try and fix them, all we're doing is strengthening and repairing a machine that's already doing what it's supposed to do. So we can only make it worse by trying to reform the system. It really is time to start from scratch. And that foundation you mentioned was that ultimately parents are responsible, and parents should be the primary educators of our kids. So it also strikes me that we need to be very careful as Christians when we lean toward the idea of Christian education in general, that we're not replacing the broken public school system with the Christian model of that. We need to be careful that parents are still the primary educators, and that the foundations of that don't model after this thing that we know doesn't work for our nation. You have talked about Robert Owen and you glossed over John Dewey a little bit. Go back to the beginning and tell us who the people were who put this into play and what was their motivation. I know you've said Robert Owen meant to undermine the Christian faith. Go into that a little further.
Yeah, happy to do it. And I think Robert Owen is such an important historical figure, and he's almost completely unknown today. It's just very, very bizarre to me that such an important historical figure has been erased from our history books. But so Robert Owen he was born in Wales. He married into a very wealthy industrial family that operated a textile operation. And he ended up taking over the textile operation. So he became very wealthy. And he had these very bizarre ideas for social reform. Of course, he rejected Christianity, which led to very seriously flawed conclusions, like, oh, we don't need all this family stuff. Oh, we don't need this private property stuff. To his credit, he was a true believer. A lot of the people who push these crazy ideas, they don't believe in this stuff, and they just see it as a means to expand their own power, their own wealth, their own control. It does seem to me like Robert Owen genuinely believed this silly stuff would work. And I say that because he actually bought a piece of land in Indiana and started a commune to kind of show how great these ideas would be. It's probably needless to say, but it failed very, very rapidly. It didn't even last for a whole 2 years. But what he wanted to do was try to show that we really didn't need families. And even before he started the commune, he was working on these things. So one of the things that he did with his textile operation was try out this new idea of, hey, let's get the kids from their parents really, really early and see if we can get them to think more like little collectivists. He wanted to pry these children loose from their parents at 2 years old and get them into these kind of daycare facilities. This was way before daycare was a real thing. So they started doing this, and they started doing these weird social experiments. Eventually that culminated with this compound. Now, Robert Owen wrote a lot. He had all these different essays on his view about how government should operate. He ultimately wanted to eliminate private property. He wanted to sideline parents and have children raised by the collective. Of course, two full frontal assaults on God's divinely ordained order for human life, etc. So he fails with this commune, but he comes to the conclusion that the reason it failed is not because he was rejecting biblical principles. The reason it failed is because these children who then became adults had been raised in an individualistic environment. That's a term you hear a lot with all these guys who are responsible for creating the school, the individualism, right? We got to reduce the individualism. So he set out to change this by having the government get involved in education. Now, I think for people today, that doesn't seem all that radical. For people 200 years ago when he was doing this, that was extremely radical. Government had essentially no role at all in education. Primarily, it was parents, and then to the extent that parents needed or wanted any help, they would go to the church, they would go to their neighbors, they would go to their extended family. There was no role for government to speak of. So he sets up what a whistleblower later described as a secret society. It's very, very interesting, this story, almost entirely unknown. But one of the guys who was involved with this secret society, Orestes Brownson was his name, he was very committed to this cause. He was actually organizing a part of New York State for this cause. And he said the twin objectives, on the surface at least, were changing public opinion, right? They wanted to go out and teach people why government ought to be involved in education. And then they wanted to get men elected to the legislatures of the states who would also support at least the camel's nose under the tent, right? They didn't come out and say, hey, we want your kids for 9 months for 7 hours a day. But just let the government have a little role. And then, so Orestes Brownson eventually becomes a Catholic, and he repents of his involvement in this wickedness and decides to blow the whistle. He writes a whole book about it. Wow. And he says that the ultimate objective, the end goal of this, in his words, was to destroy, to eliminate Christianity. And he says, we weren't going to say that openly, right? But what we wanted, he says, was a system of state and then national education whereby we could exclude everything that couldn't be verified by the census. And he said, we wouldn't directly attack the clergy, but we would bring them into contempt and ridicule them wherever we could. So that was the end goal. Now, why did they want to eliminate Christianity? Well, probably because they were serving Satan. But from their perspective, the reason was that Christianity was a giant obstacle to their plans. You couldn't eliminate private property when God said, thou shalt not steal. You can't steal people's stuff if everybody believes that it's a divine decree that you not steal people's stuff. You can't dismantle the family as long as people believe it's a divinely ordained institution. So that's why they wanted that idea. Now, the history here gets really interesting. According to Robert Owen, and it gets very hard to track, secret society. Brownson said it was based on the Carbonari of Europe. But the ambassador for the dictator of Prussia gets a hold of these essays that Robert Owen had been writing. And he, according to Robert Owen, so much approved of these ideas. He was still smarting from losing a war with Napoleon. Things weren't going well in Prussia. They thought, maybe if I could just get more obedient serfs, maybe if they would just, obey me without question, then maybe I wouldn't have lost that that war. So he tells his interior minister, hey, take these documents, set up a school based on this, and that is the first system we can find anywhere of education of the state, by the state, for the state. And then that gets re-imported into the United States by another man who rejected Christianity. He was a Unitarian by the name of Horace Mann. Now, I can't directly trace the secret society to Horace Mann, but the principles are exactly the same. Horace Mann studied the Prussian system, and then his goal was to bring that into Massachusetts. That's exactly what he did.
Yeah, I'm struck by the life of another founder of modern education, John Dewey, who traveled to Russia, studied the Russian system, loved this socialist and Marxist system so much that he then came back and established teachers' colleges, and that flooded the school system. How deeply is Marxism embedded in modern public education?
Yeah, Marxism and modern public education are so intimately intertwined that they're basically inseparable, right? Marx was the first one. Now, Marx came after Robert Owen. So Robert Owen kind of pioneered some of these ideas before Marx even came on the scene. But Marx was very, very explicit. If you read the Communist Manifesto, one of the 10 planks, one of the key tenets, the key ideas of this manifesto was the idea that the government should educate children. And you know, people today read over that and they don't think it's a big deal, but they don't understand how unbelievably radical that sounded in the mid-1800s to people who had no conception of government involvement in education. So it's a Marxist idea. Now, John Dewey was a really interesting character. As you said, he was a communist through and through. He believed in the principles of communism. He went to the Soviet Union, and if you want to see what he thought about the Soviet Union, he left a huge paper trail. He wrote all these articles in the New Republic magazine, which are still available today. It's absolutely bonkers. I mean, you think this guy must have just lived in a different universe or something. No mention of the mass murder, no mention of the just ruthless and barbaric persecution of Christians, the effort to exterminate the church. None of that, right? Instead, he's crowing about the wonderful instilling of a collectivistic mentality into the children in these government institutions pretending to be schools. It's just bonkers. And so he ends up taking the system that Horace Mann had laid down and really weaponizing it radically. I mean, because, you know, Horace Mann would have liked to, I think, seen some of these things, but America was still way too Christian. I mean, when he proposed getting the Bible out of the schools, that was like, really? I mean, what is this guy talking about? How would you educate children without the Bible? By the time John Dewey comes along, we had already been dumbed down. We had already been through, a generation or two of this. So by the time World War I is over, for the first time in American history, you have most children in government schools. And John Dewey, without even a close second, became the dominant influence in this school system. He did have one difference of opinion with the Marxists, and I think it's important in the interest of fairness to point this out. Marx and most of his disciples believed in violent revolution. They believed that the proletariat should rise up and essentially wage war on the bourgeoisie, the property owners, the businessmen, the owners of capital, etc. He believed that violence was a critical part of bringing about this utopia. He had this kind of dialectical view of history where conflict is what produces evolution, etc. And so he believed that a violent conflict was necessary to bring this about. John Dewey, in his defense, did not advocate a violent overthrow of the existing system. He advocated for a gradual approach. So he believed in the same end, he just had a different view on the means. Marx said, hey, let's rise up and murder these people, basically, if they want to submit to our new dictatorship of the proletariat. John Dewey said, no, that's not going to be effective. Let's do this gradually. Let's brainwash the children through a government school system. Let's get them little by little to embrace these ideas. He actually pointed to a novel that had been published in 1888 by another very, very prominent American socialist, who, again, has been written out of our history books, despite his importance. His name was Edward Bellamy. This guy was so influential that all over the country, these Bellamy societies were popping up, where all these intellectuals would get together and talk about how do we get there. And the goal, as Edward Bellamy put it out, he outlined it in his book, Looking Backward. He outlined this future of a communist America in the year 2000, where there would be no private property, where the family would disintegrate, and we'd have this utopia. So that was John Dewey's view. And he worked really, really hard to bring that view about through the manipulation of children in the schools. He was also responsible for bringing this entire cabal of communists into the United States. We've got a chapter on it in the book. It's called the Frankfurt School. It was the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, Germany. This was actually a project of the Comintern, the Communist Internationale. And so they set up this institute in Frankfurt, where they were thinking, how do we move Western societies toward communism? Because they were honest with themselves. They realized that Marx's idea that the working class was going to overthrow the bourgeoisie was just not going to happen in Western society. So Antonio Gramsci was working on this in Italy. The Frankfurt School was working on this in Frankfurt. Well, the International Socialists, the Frankfurt School, didn't really get along with the National Socialists, the Nazis. And so the Frankfurt School was brought over to the United States by John Dewey and John Dewey's sugar daddy, the Rockefellers. So they bring these guys over here. They put them up at Teachers College at Columbia University. From there, they go over to the University of California system. They spread out throughout the whole country and start pumping these poisonous Marxist ideas like critical theory, the authoritarian personality is what they used to label the American father. The American father, they said, was authoritarian. His influence needed to be restrained. Why? Well, because they understood that fathers in the Christian tradition would protect their families, would resist any effort to steal freedom, to hurt their families, etc. So they specifically targeted the American father as a giant obstacle in the path to their utopia. But John Dewey, again, the most significant figure probably in public education in all of human history. He ended up becoming the honorary life president of the National Education Association. And he actually founded a new religion, Garrett, and I think it's worth sharing this with people. Him and about 30 of his buddies, mostly from academia, wrote the Humanist Manifesto. The Humanist Manifesto, very important document. You can still read it today. They've got updated versions, but the core is all the same. Basically communism. They say we need to restructure the ownership system and the means of production. We need to get rid of the profit motive. But the most important things are right at the top. It says we believe the universe is self-existing and not created. Right? Direct attack on Christianity. So that was his kind of religion. And ultimately, it's just, the same lie that we heard from Satan in the garden. Ye shall be as gods, right? So you get to determine for yourself what's right or wrong. And then this religion of John Dewey's was actually established as the national religion of the United States by the Supreme Court in 1962 and 1963, as the justice who wrote the dissent explained very clearly. He said this isn't the establishment of neutrality with respect to religion, but rather the establishment of the religion of secularism. So that's John Dewey for you in a nutshell, a communist who wanted to overthrow our system, who hijacked and took control of the public education system, and the rest is history, as they say.
You touched on this idea of a slow, gradual, kind of gentle revolution as opposed to Marx's all-out revolution. And it's very clear now that the Fabian socialists won. The Fabian socialists were those who intended for a gradual, peaceful turnover, and they have won. Even in America, where we see ourselves as a free constitutional republic, we are essentially a socialist nation now. The schools are completely socialist. You talk about the authoritarian father, that's toxic masculinity, right?
That's
Which
right.
is poured out all over us. And every one of these planks has now been established. Now, I want to jump back to one other foundational educational principle, because I've heard you speak on this before, and I think it's critical to understand this, even in light of the Christian faith, and that is literacy. It seems that education, the foundational measure of education would be, can the people read? Can the people gain their own knowledge, and can they transmit their knowledge? And yet we have a giant literacy crisis in the schools and in culture. How did that happen?
Yeah, and actually that story is intimately intertwined with the emergence of government schools. It's a fascinating story. I'll try to condense it into just a few minutes. So it begins actually very innocently. There's a Reverend Golodet, who had learned from some French monks this new approach to teaching reading. Now, Reverend Golodet was overseeing what they called back then an asylum for the deaf and the dumb in Connecticut. It just was an institution to help children who were deaf and mute and couldn't speak, couldn't hear, to be able to get by in the world, right? It wasn't like today where the Americans with Disabilities Act and everything has to be handicap friendly. It was a very different world back then. And so Reverend Golodet came up with this idea that, hey, these children can't hear, so we certainly can't teach them that a P makes a P sound or a T makes a T sound, and you can blend it with this vowel and it'll make it sound like this, which is, of course, the core of our writing system, right? We have a phonetic writing system where each letter represents one or more, or is a symbol representing one or more sounds, and then you can blend those sounds together. And anything that you can say, you can put down on paper. Well, for a deaf child, that doesn't make any sense because they can't hear what that sound sounds like. And so teaching a child to read phonetically when they're deaf is just not an option. And so Reverend Golodet says, hey, why don't we teach these children to memorize whole words? And that way, they might not be able to memorize all the words in the English language. That would be quite a challenge. But if they're really smart, maybe they can memorize a few hundred, maybe even a couple thousand. And so for the deaf children, this was really a giant success. They went from being able to read absolutely nothing to being able to at least get an understanding of what was on the page. And that was all great. Kudos to Reverend Golodet for his godly efforts to help people who were less fortunate, and we appreciate that. Well, the problem comes when Horace Mann had started setting up these government schools in Massachusetts. He was importing the Prussian system back to the United States. And he had gotten himself selected as the first ever Secretary of Education. We had never had in any state a Secretary of Education. And he thinks, well, hey, if this works so great for the deaf children, I bet it'll work even better for the non-deaf children. So he tells the public schools in Boston that were just getting off the ground to start using this new method to teach reading. Now, the schoolmasters of these Boston schools were quite clever. And within 2 years, they wrote this blistering critique. Actually, Dr. Sam Blumenfeld, who I worked with very closely, he and I co-authored Crimes of the Educators together over a decade ago. He reprinted this essay as an appendix in one of his books, The New Illiterates from 1973. It's a brilliant essay. They were very polite back then. It wasn't like today where, Trump and Biden call each other names and things. They were very polite. But what they said was, hey, this proposed change that offered by Mr. Mann is neither called for nor sustained by sound reasoning, right? Which is the 1800s way of saying, you idiot, what are you doing? This doesn't work. We're not going to continue. So that was stopped. We didn't hear about it again until John Dewey comes on the scene. Now, this is really interesting. So John Dewey sets up an experimental school at the University of Chicago with funding from the Rockefeller dynasty and decides, hey, let's try it again. It didn't work back when Horace Mann tried it 50, 60 years ago, but let's try it again and let's see what happens. So they tried out in this experimental school, a $3 million school, and sure enough, they graduated a bunch of kids who couldn't read, including, incidentally, some of the Rockefeller boys. So they think, well, this will be perfect. So John Dewey loves the results of this. He ends up working with some of his buddies, some of his colleagues to create new reading primers based on these principles. And the descendants of those, some of them are still around today, the Dick and Jane readers, see, spot, run, spot, run, right? Teaching kids to memorize whole words. And these, because of the prestige of the University of Chicago, because of the prestige of Teachers College at Columbia University, which even back then was considered, the leading or one of the leading educational colleges in the country. So these start spreading across the United States. Now, after World War II, when there was a lot more money to spare, more and more school districts started buying these programs, and very, very rapidly, we just saw this cataclysm when it came to reading. It was so bad, a book that became a major bestseller at the time, Why Johnny Can't Read, was published in the 1950s. And he explained very clearly why Johnny couldn't read. And I'm paraphrasing here, but it was something like, the reason Johnny can't read is because the teaching of reading in all the schools, in all the textbooks, is totally wrong and flies in the face of all logic and common sense. So that's why Johnny couldn't read. Well, that caused a major scandal. So some of the school districts kind of walked it back a little bit, but the totalitarians were not done. They insisted on continuing this methodology. So Sam Blumenfeld exposes it in 1973 with the New Illiterates. And, fast forward to today, we've got the Common Core that we talked about a little bit earlier. Well, under Common Core, if you read it, in kindergarten, children are going to be, according to the text, memorizing what they call high-frequency words. And so you've got various lists of words they're supposed to memorize. The common ones, the Dolch list, the Fry list, right? And I'm sure some homeschoolers are thinking, oh, no, not the, yeah, those, right? Nope. So they get the kids to memorize all these words. And to kind of get into the mechanics of how this works, right? When you're memorizing a whole word, what they're doing is they're teaching children to see these words as if the word itself is a symbol. Of course, the word is not a symbol. The word is a collection of symbols that has to be deciphered by sounding it out. But when you teach the child to approach the word as if it were a symbol in and of itself, they'll be okay if they can memorize a few hundred. They'll be okay with the very basic books like See, Spot, Run, Spot, Run, because you've memorized run, you've memorized spot, and you've memorized see. But what happens when you get to a word that you haven't memorized? Well, as you look at these reading tools, they say, well, now you have to use your word attack skills. You got to look for context clues, look if there's any pictures on the page, see what the word before and after. This is preposterous, right? So this is a deliberate agenda. And I think the simplest way to understand the true agenda, Garrett, is to go back to the first education law ever passed in North America. This was 1640s, the Old Deluder Satan Act. The Pilgrims said it's so critical that everyone can read, because that old deluder Satan wants to keep them from knowledge of the scriptures, that we're going to make sure every person in this colony can read. Now, it was a Bible colony, right? There was no separation of church and state. And so they said, your town and your church need to make sure everybody can read. And so that's the genesis of universal literacy in America. I think it can be easily demonstrated that John Dewey understood that literacy was the key to, first of all, biblical understanding. Second of all, independence and freedom. If you can't educate yourself, you are a helpless person. Today with YouTube and audiobooks, some of us can overcome that handicap. But 100 years ago, we didn't have YouTube and audiobooks, right? You were completely at the mercy of the education establishment if you couldn't read. So I think this was done deliberately for the purpose of dumbing down Americans so that they could be manipulated into giving up their freedoms, giving up their families, and ultimately surrendering all of the things that God had blessed our nation with, that we were entrusted to be good stewards over.
Amen. I know you've got to go, and we're right up against the limit here, but I'd love it if you would share just a minute of encouragement. We've heard all of the bad stuff, right? What hope would you give parents in light of this?
Well, I think one of the big bright sides is that in every one of the 50 states, you can still opt out of this system legally. We don't have to defy the government. In every state, you can pull your children out of this wicked system right now. And as Garritt alluded to earlier, you don't want to replicate government school at home, right? I encourage you to think about the most basic questions. What is the purpose of education, right? The world has its view. I asked Google, I asked all the AIs, and in their view, the purpose of education is to make you successful. What does that even mean, right? What if you lived in National Socialist Germany? Does that mean you're really good at rounding up Jews? You're really good at overseeing the concentration camp? I mean, that's a terrible metric for what education ought to be about. So start from the basic questions. Pull your children out of the system if you haven't yet, and embark on this journey. And that doesn't mean that you can't delegate some of these tasks to others. Get together with a homeschool co-op, get together with some other Christian families and do education and life together. But I'm really encouraged by what's happening on this front, Garritt. We've seen a massive exodus from this diabolical system. Millions of families have fled in recent years, and I guarantee you millions more are going to be fleeing in the years ahead. There is an exodus of massive proportions taking place right now. Almost everybody across the political spectrum understands that the system is not doing what normal people expect it to do, which is educate children. And so we've got a lot going for us. We have to get it right. There are efforts now to destroy home education. We must resist those. There are efforts to bring home education under the control of the state by offering us free money. Think of that like the cheese in the mousetrap, right? Don't eat the cheese. It's not really free. It's there to sucker you back into the system. But be encouraged, ladies and gentlemen. God has given us everything that we need in His Word to be able to properly educate our children. And in this country, we are still free to do that, and millions of families have already chosen to do that. If you're not one of them, join us today. If you are already, sound the alarm. Right? The school system is on fire. What kind of people would we be if we didn't let other people know that their children were inside a burning building? We've got to get them out. We've got to do it now. It is, I believe, the most important battle. And if your pastor says, oh no, we just focus on the Great Commission here, don't tell me that you're going to disciple the nations when you're losing 80% of the children in your congregation. That's foolishness. Amen. Our first ministry is to our family, and we've got to take this real serious.
Well, Alex, I couldn't say it any better than that. That is just perfect. Thank you so much for your time today. How can people get a hold of you or find your resources?
Well, thank you so much, Garritt. So the easiest way to get this book is actually on Amazon. If people want a signed copy, they can get it from my website, libertysentinel.org. You can go to /shop, and it's available there. It'll take a little longer, and I got to charge shipping. People can sign up for my newsletter there, libertysentinel.org, thenewamerican.com, great magazine, and I'm also on Twitter, or X as they call it. It's Alex Newman _JOU. And thanks again, Garritt, for having me. It's really an honor. I so appreciate everything that you and your family do for the Lord and for the church and for the homeschool community. So thank you, guys.
Man, thank you so much. Alex, I'm going to have you back to talk about school choice next time, because you teased that at the end. But I really appreciate your time today, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, brother. God bless you.
Well, I hope you've been encouraged today by our conversation with Alex Newman. I want to encourage you to head over to thinkingdad.net. That's where you'll find the show notes for this episode. I'll link to everything that Alex has done and everything he talked about today. He has a wealth of great resources. definitely check out those in the show notes. Also, while you're there, you can pick up a t-shirt. You can see today I'm wearing my Thinking Dad t-shirt. We have a couple of other great designs on the store. It's a great way to support the show and really look cool in the process. Take a minute too while you're there to sign up for our newsletter. Because this is a seasonal podcast, the newsletter's the best way to know when new episodes and new seasons are coming. Check it out. We're never going to spam you. And if you'd like to support the show, you can make a one-time or monthly donation there, thinkingdad.net. Stick around till the very end to hear a clip of what's coming up next time on The Thinking Dad, and we'll see you back here real soon.
We're in that very beginning part of the cycle for tough times. We've been fat and happy. We've been enjoying we're lazy because we enjoy so much freedom. We got all these blessings, and why would you go do the hard work? And so for a long time now, decades, we haven't had to do the hard work. We've been living on the fumes of previous generations paying the price. And we got to raise the bar and say, I'm willing to give more of my life, that's my time, more of my money, of course, that's our fortune, and more of my sacred honor, which is my reputation. I'm willing to put it all on the line. Every single one of us has to be willing to do that.